Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will be beginning, albeit with a slight delay. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you who've come here today, especially our distinguished panelists who've honored us with their presence, who've agreed to take part in this conference and come to Warsaw for these 2 days to share their thoughts with us, their thoughts about archives and their artistic experience, their experience of archives in the theoretical and historic sense. I'd like to welcome all of you. I'd also like to welcome the Krakow contingent, as well as all those of you who are coming here for the photography month. This conference is being webcast to Krakow and generally made available to anyone interested. And welcome to this conference. Us meeting here today at Brave New World at Nowy Wspaniały Świat Club and Cafe to discuss practically and theoretically matters related to the archive and photography is very important, not only for us as the foundation, the organizers, but for all of us present here today. One could, of course, claim that the topic is a little dated, that we are now witnessing the second wave of interest in archives for some time now. But I feel that there is a lot more to be said about this subject, and I'm sure that this meeting will ultimately prove fruitful. A lot has been said about archives, a lot has been happening related to archives. In Poland, for instance, all the humanities in the year 2009 at Photography Month, there was an exhibition called the Central Archive, along with an accompanying program. Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź had a year-long program for which they published a 3-part publication called Working Title Archive. The titles, both these publications are laid out on the table outside, and in conjunction with the Institute of Art History of Warsaw University, there was a conference organized in 2009, Archive Fever, organized by Louisa Nader, or programmed by Louisa Nader. So this conference is a follow-up to those events. Back then we were thinking of following up the subject, and today, in truly international company, we can proceed to discuss it at greater length. The need for theoretical reflection and for comparing our notes with the experience of other people dealing with archives is very present in our foundation, because on an everyday basis we're very much involved in archival activity and the archival order. Because the need for theoretical thought is great, and we believe that the exchange between various because this conference brings together theoreticians and practitioners, persons from state institutions and NGOs, as well as artists and scholars. This is a melting pot, if you will, for thoughts and experience, and we hope that this will be put to use as the conference proceedings will be published in a few months. We have 2 fairly intense but fascinating days in store for us, and I also encourage you to mingle, exchange business cards and whatnot, and take advantage of this opportunity, because this conference is also an encounter. That's why we asked you to wear name tags, so we can get to know one another. This is part of a greater project that this foundation has been doing for 18 months. It's called the Photo Registry, a project financed by Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway by a grant from Iceland, Liechtenstein, through the EEA financial mechanism and the Norwegian financial mechanism, as well as by the Ministry of Culture and the Arts. These are long names, but I need to name them because without our grant-given institutions, we would not have been meeting here. Our partner is the Norwegian Technological Museum of Technology, the meeting place with history, and additionally, the Visual Arts Foundation, the organizer of the Photography Month in Krakow. And now I'd like to hand it over to Krzysztof Pijarski, who's programmed this entire conference. He's proposed the theoretical guidelines for this conference, and he'll now say a few words of introduction and introduce our panelists. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to welcome you here today on the first day of this conference. Above all, I'd like to welcome our panelists, so we're very happy that you've agreed to come here and take part in this debate. In the debates that we'll be holding here for the next 2 days. I'll try and not take up too much of your time because I'm sure everybody's impatient to hear the first papers. Let me just remind you where we began and what led us to conceive this conference, and then I'll introduce the first panelists and we can kick off the conference. We decided the Archivist Project conference, we decided ought to center around 5 major topics, which ultimately determined the structure of our meeting. These main topics are, first of all, the relationship or the issue of poetics and the politics of archives. We are specifically interested in archives not as places or institutions, but as a broader phenomenon, as a metaphor. And by being so ubiquitous, by being overused as a metaphor, we felt that it was worth revisiting critical debates about archives that have already taken place, or to rethink the question of archives. So the link with poetics and politics. And it's also about reconsidering the neutrality, the objectivity, impartiality of an archive to show to what extent the construction of an archive is politically motivated and to what extent it is aesthetic, if I might put it that way. So that's why we invited artists to take part in this conference. Another matter that interested us when we were planning this conference was the totality and the fragmented nature of archives, the inherent assumption that an archive can contain the totality of something, that by its fragmentary nature, and in fact, that an arbitrary set or collection of documents can represent a totality, can represent a whole. That's something we'd like to reflect upon. And we're also interested in matters of technology, the links between archive memory and technology. This was a matter that was addressed on a number of occasions. It will be the subject of a separate session tomorrow morning, where we'll be talking about digitalization, new techniques of processing and archiving, how they affect our understanding of memory, how they affect our writing of history or telling about recounting future events. We're also interested in matters more practical. That's why we invited representatives of eminent and interesting institutions, often some small, some large, that have archives of their own, to see how archives operate in practice, to see what problems, what matters persons shaping and defining archives contend with, and how this can be brought up against theoretical perspectives. And the last issue is the sacrality or the unsacred nature of archives, the archive as esoteric, as a secret, the archive as a node of authority, the archive as a source, as a font of stories and constructs for historic identities. And in this text, I indicated the possibility of profanation of this, desecration of this archive, and the holiness and the unholiness, and the restoring of archives, the reopening of archives, providing free access for everyone, and not having archives locked off from the general public, and not, of course, in a literal sense. And that is why these questions led us to split up this conference into three parts, three panels. The first panel, the theoretical panel, that's meant to provide a foundation for our thinking, to be a starting point to help us move beyond the archive, the specialized field, and to link it with various other areas of practice and knowledge. And then we'll also have panels with participants who work in archives or institutions that assemble or manage archives. We will be talking about practicalities. And then there will be panels which are an encounter between an artist who works with archives, in their practice, and theorists and critics. We want to investigate this, negotiate this relationship between theory and practice. We'll see how this works, and we'll see how the two realms can interweave and overlap. And now that's about it as regards the general premise of this conference. I think that there's a lot of interesting things in store for us, and we'll see what the outcome of this two-day conference will be. And that's why, at the end, we wanted to have an open panel discussion to be moderated by Dr. Marianna Michałowska from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, where we'll be able to bring together, wrap up all the thoughts that will be expressed at this conference. And before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to thank a couple of people. I'd like to thank Karolina Lewandowska for asking me to program this conference. It was fascinating work, and I'm glad that so many of you have come to this conference. This proves that the subject is relevant and topical and worth discussing. I'd like to thank everybody involved in making this conference possible. I did program the conference, but I couldn't have done it alone. I'd like to thank all the employees of our foundation, and above all, Piotr Słodkowski, who runs the conference office, without whom nothing would have been possible. He was the cornerstone. I'd also like to He was a bulwark. We could always rely on him. We'd like to say hi to our listeners in Krakow. This is being webcast to Krakow with some delay. In Krakow, they're just about opening photography month, and today's the opening, and we thought that it would be a shame for everybody interested in photography to miss this conference, so we are providing this opportunity to them as a live webcast in the festival office in Krakow, which means that we'll have many more participants. And now the first panel will be about archives in theory. And briefly, a few words about our panelists. we'll have Professor John Tagg from the University of... here we go. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Actually, our first speaker will be Sven Speaker, who teaches at Santa Barbara, and he's written a book called The Big Archive, Art from Bureaucracy, and it's, among others, owing to his commitment, his interest in the relation between archives and artistic practice that we wanted very much to have him here, and we're happy that he will be delivering the presentation. Our next speaker will indeed be Professor John Tagg from New York State University in Binghamton, State University of New York. He's written texts about the history of photography in the Anglo-American tradition. I think that Professor Tagg is probably the leading author of similar texts, along with Alan Sekula. In fact, I think their early texts about photography can be placed on a par, can be definitely compared. And John Tagg is increasingly being interested in archives, so we're all the more happy that he's come here. Our next speaker will be Professor Helen Petrovsky from the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, who's written extensively about Walter Benjamin. She's a media theorist, and she's written a lot about Boris Mikhailov, who will be the subject of her first paper today. Our next speaker is Natasha Petreshin-Bashelez, who's a curator and art critic. She teaches at EHSS. Called Something You Should Know. She's curated many shows of Central and Eastern European art of the 1970s. And she will be discussing the relationship between archive, document, and artistic practice. This panel will be moderated by Professor Wolfgang Ernst, who will be delivering a presentation tomorrow, but for the time being, he's the moderator of the first theoretical panel. He's a professor at Humboldt University in Berlin, and his book, the book which led us to invite him, was about archives, and it was called Das Rumoren der Archive, Ordnung aus Unordnung. So, if we can begin the first panel.